Ever get that feeling where you just want to like really grasp something, something that's kind of complex, but without having to like wade through a ton of material?
Yeah, totally.
Well, that's what we're doing today. We're going to take a fascinating area of research and we're going to pull out the most, worthy bits for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And today's deep dive is something that I think a lot of people have probably experienced, which is the ups and downs of learning a foreign language.
Mm.
We're going to explore a really interesting idea.
Hmm.
The difficulties that you might have encountered learning a new language
Hmm.
could actually be linked back to how you learned your first language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I'm already intrigued because when I'm personally struggling with like the past subjunctive in Italian, it feels totally disconnected from how I learned to read, English back in elementary school.
right.
But the research that we've looked at, particularly this thing called the linguistic coding deficit hypothesis, LCDH, suggests that these things might be more connected than we think.
Absolutely, yeah. The LCDH initially was really important in helping us understand learning disabilities,
Mm.
but more broadly, it proposes that if your brain has any kind of difficulties processing your native language,
Hmm.
specifically the sounds, the grammar, and the meaning that can create real roadblocks when you try to pick up a second language.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is fascinating.
Yeah, we have some really insightful material to look at today, including a key research article that really lays out the LCDH and some fascinating real-life examples that really bring this idea home.
Okay, cool. So our goal today is to really understand this LCDH.
Right.
Why is it that some folks who are brilliant in other areas, they suddenly hit this wall with foreign languages? What exactly are these linguistic coding issues?
Right.
And could they be the hidden reason behind these struggles?
Yeah, exactly. I think a good place to start is really with what's at the heart of this LTDH. As you said, the main idea is that challenges you faced when you were learning your first language can indeed make learning a second one harder. And what's interesting is that, this idea really started with researchers who were looking at students who had diagnosed learning disabilities.
Uh-huh.
But researchers, like Pimsleur, started to notice this pattern in students that he called underachievers in languages,
Okay.
people who were otherwise doing well academically.
Got it. So we're not just talking about people with like diagnosed learning difficulties.
Right.
This could be me, doing great in math and science, and then suddenly Spanish class, I feel like I've landed on another planet.
Exactly. That's a really crucial point to understand. So linguistic coding is just the term we use to describe how efficiently your brain processes language.
Okay.
Think of it as having these three main gears. We have the phonological,
Mm-hmm.
which is all about the sounds of language.
Mm-hmm.
We have the syntactic, which is about grammar
Mm-hmm.
and the structure of language.
Uh-huh.
And we have the semantic, which is about understanding the meaning of language.
Okay. So it's like the, core software for our language abilities.
Exactly.
And if one of those gears isn't quite meshing in our native language, the LCDH suggests that it's going to be that much harder to run a new language program.
Exactly. And the hypothesis really emphasizes that phonological part.
Ah.
Your ability to hear and tell apart and work with the sounds of language as a really big source of difficulty for a lot of foreign language learners. And the theory even goes as far as suggesting that if you struggle with the sounds of language, that can kind of have this knock-on effect on your motivation and can actually make you feel more anxious about learning the language.
That makes total sense to me.
Yeah,
If you are constantly mishearing words or you can't get your mouth to like make the right sounds,
Huh.
it's going to be so frustrating.
yeah, it can feel really defeating.
Yeah, and it's going to make you want to avoid it.
Absolutely. And the research also shows that if you have difficulty with rote memorization, that can add yet another layer of difficulty to
Mhm.
foreign language learning, particularly when it comes to things like memorizing new vocabulary words and grammar rules.
Yeah.
And importantly, studies have shown that students who are identified as being at risk for struggling with foreign languages,
Mm-hmm.
even if they don't have a formal learning disability diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
often show very similar kinds of difficulties with this linguistic coding compared to students who do have learning disabilities.
Okay.
And both groups tend to struggle more than successful foreign language learners.
So this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah,
Because this isn't just like someone's opinion.
right.
This is, real research that backs this up.
Exactly.
So can you give us a little background on how this idea came about and some of the key studies that support the LCDH?
Absolutely. So early on, researchers started noticing a pattern.
Okay.
For example, back in the mid-1980s, Ganshow and Sparks did some really in-depth studies with college students who were really struggling to meet their foreign language requirements. And what they noticed was that these students often had a history of challenges with their native language.
Yeah.
Things like difficulty learning to read,
Huh.
or a history of speech or language issues. They also seem to really struggle with teaching methods that involve a lot of listening and repeating, which was a common approach back then.
Okay, so even before they even encountered a new language, there were signs in how they learned their first language that
Yeah.
something was a little different.
Exactly.
Okay.
Building on that, in 1989, Sparks, Ganshow, and Pullman looked at college students who had actually been granted waivers from having to take a foreign language at all.
Oh, wow.
And what's really striking is that even though these students had average to above average IQs, when they tested them in more detail, they showed subtle but significant difficulties in how they processed sounds, grammar, and meaning in English.
So it wasn't about intelligence. It was
Right.
something more specific to how their brains handle language.
Exactly. And they looked more closely at these language processing difficulties and how the students performed in their foreign language courses. And what emerged was this pattern. It seemed that difficulties with processing the sounds of language had the biggest and most immediate negative impact on how they did in the foreign language classroom. If they struggled with the sounds, they often couldn't even pass the first year, whereas students who mainly had difficulty with grammar or meaning sometimes made it further before hitting a wall.
That makes sense. It really emphasizes how fundamental being able to process those sounds of a new language is.
Yeah, it's a foundational.
It's like trying to understand a song when your headphones are broken.
That's a great analogy.
Like you just can't.
Yeah. And the researchers even drew connections to students with reading difficulties like dyslexia.
Oh, interesting.
Work by people like Villatino and Scanlon showed that reading disabilities often have their roots in language-based learning issues,
Okay.
especially with the sounds and the structure of language, not with understanding the meaning of words.
Uh-huh.
This fits perfectly with the idea that if you struggle with the sounds in your native language, it might make it harder to decode the sounds of a foreign language.
So the same underlying challenges that make learning to read English difficult might also be at play when you're trying to make sense of the sounds in Spanish or French or whatever.
Exactly, that's the core of it.
Wow.
Furthermore, if you look at how foreign language aptitude tests were developed,
Okay.
tests like Carolyn Sapon's MLT
Uh-huh.
and Pimsleur's LAB, you'll see that they include sections that are specifically designed to test how well you can process sounds and your auditory abilities.
Okay.
Pimsleur even found that your ability to hear and process sounds was a key factor in explaining why some people struggled with foreign languages even when they were really intelligent and motivated.
That's interesting. It's almost like these aptitude tests were unintentionally tapping into these underlying native language processing skills all along.
Precisely. And more recent research has continued to kind of bolster support for the LCDH.
Okay.
For example, in a 1991 study, Ganshow and his colleagues compared college students who were successful in learning foreign languages to those who weren't. And what they found was that there were significant differences in how well the two groups processed sounds and grammar, but not in their understanding of meaning.
Oh, interesting.
Again, this is pointing to those core language processing skills as being really critical.
Yeah.
They also found that scores on the MLA, that foreign language aptitude test, were really related to how well the students did in their foreign language classes.
And it wasn't just looking back at past difficulties, right?
Right.
Like they were also trying to find ways to identify, who might struggle before they even started learning a new language.
Exactly. And they developed something called the Foreign Language Screening Instrument College, or FLSIC.
Okay.
It's a bit of a mouthful. But basically, what this was designed to do was help identify students who might be at risk of struggling with foreign languages based on their history of learning their native language.
Oh, okay.
And they asked questions about things like, how easy was it to learn phonics? What were their grades in English reading? What were their grades in spelling? And these turned out to be surprisingly good indicators of potential difficulties in the foreign language classroom.
Wow. Okay.
And what they found was that the FLSIC also showed a strong link to scores on the MLA, which suggests that they're measuring similar underlying abilities.
Now, this is something I think that's really important for our listeners to consider if you've struggled with languages in the past,
Yeah.
which is the research into how students feel about language learning. It's easy to assume that if someone's having a hard time, it's because they're just not trying hard enough or they're
Yeah.
too nervous about speaking.
Absolutely. That's a really common assumption.
Yeah.
And Jaworski Sparks and Ganshow, actually looked into this in a 1992 study.
Hmm.
What they did was they examined how college students with and without learning disabilities felt about their foreign language skills and their attitudes towards learning a new language.
Yeah.
And what they found was that while the students with learning disabilities felt less confident in their language abilities, there wasn't a significant difference in how motivated they were to learn the language,
Oh, wow.
which suggests that the anxiety that many struggling learners experience might actually be a result of the learning difficulties themselves, rather than the main reason they're not succeeding.
So the frustration of not being able to grasp the language can lead to feeling anxious.
Right.
It's not necessarily that feeling anxious prevents you from learning in the first place.
Exactly. That's the implication of the research. And these findings weren't just seen in college students. Studies on high school students who were at risk of struggling with foreign languages showed really similar results, again highlighting those underlying difficulties with processing the sounds and grammar of their native language were key factors in early struggles. And they even found that high school students with learning disabilities performed very similarly to high-risk students without a formal LD diagnosis when it came to these linguistic coding skills and how they did in their foreign language courses.
So we're seeing a pretty consistent picture emerging here.
It's very consistent.
These fundamental abilities to process the sounds and grammar of your first language seem to be really important for tackling a new one.
Exactly.
And perhaps one of the most convincing pieces of evidence comes from a study that actually tried a different way of teaching.
Right.
Researchers used the Orton-Gillingham method, which is this multisensory approach known for really focusing on the sounds and structure of language.
Right.
And I know that's been very successful in helping people with dyslexia and other learning disabilities learn to read in their native language.
Exactly.
So they used this approach to teach Spanish to students who were identified as being at high risk of struggling.
Right.
And the results were really interesting.
Absolutely. The students who were taught using the Orton-Gillingham method showed significant improvement in their ability to process the sounds of their native language
Wow.
and in their aptitude for learning a foreign language compared to a group who were taught using a more traditional communicative approach.
That's a really powerful finding.
Absolutely.
It suggests that by directly addressing these underlying sound and grammar processing skills, you can actually have a positive impact on their native language abilities, as well as their potential for learning a foreign language.
It suggests that there is some malleability there that you can work on those skills and that can have positive downstream effects on foreign language learning.
That's really cool. So all of these studies taken together, they provide really strong support for this linguistic coding deficit hypothesis.
They do.
And they suggest that difficulties with understanding, meaning they're not the main reason why at-risk learners are struggling with foreign languages.
Right.
And that these students, whether they have an LD diagnosis or not, they often share these similar challenges with processing language, which really shifts our focus from just thinking about motivation and attitude
Right.
to looking at these more fundamental language processing abilities.
Exactly. That's the key takeaway here.
So we've looked at the theory, we've looked at the research. Now, to really make this relatable for our listeners, let's talk about some of these learner profiles.
Yes, I think this will really help.
The researchers observed these are like snapshots of different patterns of language strengths and weaknesses that they saw in students.
Exactly. These case studies really help us to understand the different ways that these linguistic coding strengths and weaknesses can show up in people who are learning a foreign language.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, so we have 5 examples here, each with a slightly different pattern. Let's start with Dave, who is described as high phonology, high syntax, high semantics.
So Dave sounds like the person who just breezes through language learning.
He does. Dave was a successful college student studying foreign languages, and his academic history really showed that he had always done well. He had strong SAT scores. He even came from a family where people had positive experiences learning foreign languages.
Okay.
And when they tested him, he showed strong skills in all areas of linguistic coding. He was good at spelling, recognizing made-up words which show strong phonology. He had good grammar, writing skills, strong syntax, excellent reading, comprehension, and vocabulary, strong semantics. He also had good rote memory, and he scored well on the MLT. So Dave really represents someone who has the underlying language processing abilities to really succeed in language learning.
That's cool. Now let's look at someone who had maybe a tougher time.
Okay.
Tell us about Nick, who had low phonology, average syntax, high semantics.
Okay.
This sounds like the kind of profile that the LCDH would predict would face some challenges.
Exactly.
All right.
Nick was a high school freshman who was failing Spanish despite getting some help from a tutor, and his background showed that he had difficulty with writing and persistent spelling problems, even though he was excellent in science. Interestingly, his IQ was very high, and he had strong semantic skills.
Okay.
Good vocabulary, good reading comprehension. However, when they looked at his phonological skills, they were average to below average, particularly in spelling and recognizing made-up words.
Okay.
And he also scored really low on the parts of the MLAT that focus on processing sounds. And ultimately, he failed his first-year Spanish course, and his strong understanding of meaning just couldn't compensate for those difficulties with the sounds of the language. Think of it like trying to understand someone who's speaking a language with a very strong accent that you're not used to.
Okay.
Even if you know the words they're using the way they sound, makes it hard to process.
That's a great way to put it. So a weakness in processing those sounds can be a major hurdle, even if you're understanding the concepts and the grammar relatively well.
Exactly.
What about Ed with high phonology, high syntax, low semantics? This seems like a different kind of struggle.
Yes. Ed, who was a high school sophomore who was struggling in Spanish after having failed French, had a history of a speech delay and some early difficulties with reading. But while he was pretty good with the sounds of language, he was a good speller, and his grammar skills were strong, he really struggled in areas that were related to meaning, especially understanding when people were speaking and expressing himself orally, even though his vocabulary and reading comprehension were average to above average.
Oh, interesting.
And he mentioned that he had trouble understanding directions on the MLAT and felt like things were presented too quickly. And his difficulties in the foreign language classroom really mirrored those early challenges he had with listening and speaking in his native language.
Okay.
So this shows that while phonological difficulties are common, weaknesses in other areas of language processing can also cause really significant problems.
So even if you can pronounce the words correctly, right? High phonology, if you're having trouble understanding what's being said, low semantics, you're still going to find it hard to learn.
Absolutely.
What about Ken with low phonology, low syntax, low semantics? He sounds like he faced more widespread language learning challenges.
Yeah, so Ken, who had graduated high school but really struggled academically throughout and had failed Spanish, showed weaknesses across the board.
Okay.
His intelligence testing was in the lower end of the average range, and he had below average to low average scores in how he processed sounds, grammar, and meaning in his native language. He described himself as someone who was a poor reader and speller, and his scores on the MLAT were generally low, except for one section called Spelling Clues, where he did surprisingly well.
Oh.
And the researchers thought that this might have tapped into some of his existing vocabulary knowledge. But Ken really represents a more general pattern of someone with overall weaker language processing skills, which made foreign language learning particularly challenging.
Got it.
Yeah.
And finally, we have Amy with high phonology, high syntax, high semantics, low motivation.
Right.
This highlights that language processing isn't the only factor at play here.
Exactly. So Amy was a freshman with very high intelligence and really strong language processing skills in all areas. However, she was underachieving in her academics, and her lowest grades were consistently in Spanish. And her parents felt that this was due to a lack of motivation and difficulties with organization. So while she had the underlying abilities and aptitude for learning a foreign language, her lack of engagement really prevented her from succeeding. And this case reminds us that while linguistic coding is a really important piece of the puzzle, your motivation and attitude also play a significant role in how well you learn.
Wow. These individual stories really bring the LCDH to life and show us how, different underlying language profiles can lead to very different experiences with foreign language learning.
Absolutely. I think they're so valuable.
So what does all this mean for people who teach foreign languages?
Right.
How can they use this information in their classrooms to help students like these?
Yeah, I think there are a number of important takeaways for educators. First, I think it's crucial to consider that when a student is struggling with a foreign language, there might be underlying cognitive reasons related to how they process language, rather than just assuming it's a lack of effort or a bad attitude. And looking closely at how well a student can handle the sounds, grammar, and meaning of their native language can give you some really valuable clues.
So what are some practical things that a teacher could do to get a sense of a student's phonological skills, for example?
Yeah. So in the classroom, teachers can really pay attention to how students are pronouncing new foreign language words.
Mm-hmm.
Are they consistently mispronouncing certain sounds?
Mm-hmm.
They could also try some simple tasks in English, like asking students to break down a word into its individual sounds or to say a word without a particular sound. And if a student's having trouble reading made-up words in English, that can also be a sign of these underlying phonological weaknesses.
Mm.
And if a teacher notices these kinds of, significant difficulties in this area, it might be worth suggesting that the student undergoes a more comprehensive evaluation with maybe a speech-language pathologist
Mm-hmm.
or a psychologist.
Okay, so really looking for clues in how the students interact with their first language.
Exactly.
What about in terms of like how they teach?
Yeah,
Should their methods be adjusted based on these insights?
absolutely. So for students who seem to have difficulties with processing the sounds of language teaching methods that really focus on the sounds and the written symbols of the foreign language can be really helpful.
Okay.
Just like explicit phonics instruction can help people learn to read in English directly, teaching that sound symbol system of the new language could potentially improve a student's ability to decode and produce that language. Think of it as like building a strong foundation in the building blocks of the language.
Uh-huh. And it's important to remember, as we saw with Ed, not everyone who struggles has the same profile.
Right.
Some might have intact phonological skills, but still struggle with understanding or expressing meaning.
Exactly. Recognizing that there are different types of at-risk learners is really key. For students like Ed who might be good with pronunciation but struggle with comprehension strategies that focus on building their understanding and providing more opportunities for oral practice might be more beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
This could involve things like slowing down the pace of instruction, using more visual aids, or maybe even focusing more on reading and writing if their listening and speaking skills are weaker.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about tailoring the approach to the individual student's strengths and weaknesses.
So a more personalized way of teaching, taking into account these different underlying abilities.
Precisely. And using existing screening tools and foreign language aptitude tests can also be really valuable in identifying those students who might be at risk.
Yeah.
However, it's important to look beyond just the overall score and really analyze the scores on the different sections of the test to get a better understanding of a student's specific strengths and weaknesses in areas like phonology, grammar, and understanding meaning, as well as their aptitude for different aspects of language learning.
So it really sounds like the main message for educators is to move beyond simple explanations for why some students struggle with foreign languages and really consider these underlying cognitive factors related to language processing.
Exactly. Students who struggle with foreign languages are a diverse group. Their difficulties might stem from how efficiently they process language, particularly the sounds, but it could also be related to their overall cognitive abilities or, as we saw with Amy, their level of motivation and any anxieties that they might be experiencing, which itself could be made worse by the learning challenges.
Right.
Recognizing this diversity is essential for better understanding and supporting these learners.
This has been such an insightful deep dive into the LCDH and what it tells us about foreign language learning. It really makes you think about all the hidden complexities involved in something that seems so straightforward on the surface.
It does. It's amazing how much is going on under the hood.
Yeah. So for you, our listener, as a final thought, considering this information, how might we change the way we think about language education, both learning our native language and tackling a new one to better support everyone and maybe even prevent some of that unnecessary frustration? Maybe reflecting on your own language learning journey or the experiences of people you know through this lens might offer some new perspectives.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in digging deeper, we encourage you to explore more about the LCDH and research on effective teaching methods for diverse language learners. It's a fascinating field with a lot to offer.
Thanks for joining us.
It was my pleasure.